I just started the recording just to share, and we'll be sharing the recording at the end of the webinar. Or actually, we'll be sharing that tomorrow. I'll be sending out an email where all you can access it and access the recording and the presentation from tonight. Right. So thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. We have a presentation from Yul Herbert and Ralph Torrey from Sustainable Solutions Group, SSG, who developed the assessment of IESO's Pathways to Decarbonization study from the perspective of municipal climate action plans. Just did want to provide a little bit of understanding and rationale for the report. One of the main goals of this report was to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of the IESO Pathways to Decarbonization study. We really wanted to understand the assumptions and methodology that went into that, how it is aligned, or what's the gap, or what's the difference between how the IESO is advancing its decarbonization energy planning and how municipalities are advancing their climate action plan modeling. Where is the alignment? Where's the misalignment? What's the gap that we need to fill? What's the codependencies, and what are the implications if we don't get ourselves into alignment? Those are some of the key questions that we wanted to explore. We also wanted to explore how we know that the silos are really hurting our energy planning and our decarbonization efforts. So we really wanted to understand how municipalities, utilities, IESO, Ontario Energy, and the Ministry of Energy all need to work together to support the decarbonization and electricity system investments. What role do each of them play? How do they better need to work together? And the ultimate kind of one of the other goals that we also had was to identify how we can increase energy planning literacy within municipalities. Municipalities have been putting a significant amount of time into their climate action plans, but there's still a tendency that they have to leave big system energy planning to the province, to the entities, the Ontario Energy Board, the IESO, because they haven't traditionally engaged in energy planning in the past. But with their climate action plan modeling and work that they've been undertaking, they're gaining a really important perspective on how the energy transition could play out within their communities. And there's the need for that energy literacy to be recognized, not only from municipalities themselves, but also from the IESO, from the Ministry of Energy, from the Ontario Energy Board, so that we recognize that municipal perspective is not lost. Because if our energy system and our decarbonization efforts will be severely hindered if we do not get ourselves into alignment between climate action planning at the local level and energy planning at the larger system provincial level. All right, sorry for the diatribe on that one, but I had to let it go. And this is part of the goals that we had for the report. Just before I hand it over to Yul to dig into and Yul and Ralph to dig into the report itself and the findings that they did from their assessment, I'd just like to do a land acknowledgements. The Clean Air Partnership acknowledges that the stolen land on which we operated is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat people. And the area of that we're on is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, and it really, which speaks to the important role that all the Indigenous peoples played together in supporting the Great Lakes, honoring the Great Lakes, and how the Great Lakes sustain all peoples around them. And just before we go into it, if I can just share one video that I would like to share.
For me, Indigenous Peoples Day is one of the most critical days upon the planet.
Indigenous Peoples Day lands on June 21st of each year. It was a day designated to recognize the beauty and contributions of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And then it's evolved into the celebration of a whole month.
It's a special day to show love and respect for all First Nation. and it's been so long in coming.
It's very important to celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day every day because, you know, we have a very strong, vibrant culture. We have survived a genocide, a Holocaust, and we're still here. And I think people must understand and get to know that this land has the blood of our ancestors, and they should know those stories and the history of the place that they live upon.
The point about amplifying this truth and mobilizing this knowledge is not to surface feelings of guilt or anger or shame. It's truly in an effort to get to a place of reconciliation and understanding. What I want to try to do is inspire other communities, especially those of settler ancestry, to realize their responsibility. And even though they didn't have a direct hand in some of the injustices that have occurred historically, they're inheriting an infrastructure and thoughts and patterns and beliefs that still manifest, and they're still harmful. When people are wanting to learn about this stuff, what I want them to think about is how are they taking that knowledge and how are they mobilizing what they're learning. If you are attending things like this, if you're watching this only with the intention to increase your understanding, you're being no less extractive than settler ancestors before you. The difference is, what are you going to do with this knowledge?
Today we have so many other cultures, and they need to be respected, but they need to know how to respect and to learn about who we are and how come this country is so beautiful.
Well, I'd just like to implore everyone that's non-Indigenous to take that very big and important step in their lives. We're all in this together. We should not look at our differences, but to come together as individuals and heal. That's what we need at this time upon our planet. That's the most important thing for us, is to come together and heal.
One of the things I think that's really really important about this, I'm going to stop. Sorry, I might stop my sharing. One of the things that I think is really important about this conversation as we're advancing reconciliation is one of the lines she says, we're honoring and respecting First Nations, but also recognizing the value that and the perspective that they bring. And one of the key things that I think is so critical in our climate fight that we have ahead of us is that in many ways, bringing together Western science and Indigenous knowledge is almost critical for those to come together and form a relationship with each other, because the silos between those two ways of thinking are going to undermine our climate progress and our ability to come together as a people, as a cult, as a society, to work together. And recognizing the kind of the data, the evidence-based approach, the science-based approach in solving our kind of climate challenges is absolutely critical. But so is that connection, so is that love and respect and systems thinking and understanding our codependencies across us. It's like almost like neither one can solve the problem on their own, and they both have to come together to solve our climate change challenges moving ahead of us. So I'm putting it together. It's not just only about Indigenous reconciliation as well. It's almost like a societal reconciliation that we all need to advance in order to really, truly come together to solve the climate change challenge ahead of us. But what power we would have if we can bring those two ways of looking at the world together. It would be pretty darn powerful. Okay, so I will stop right now, and I would love to turn it over to Yul and to Ralph to tell the story of their review of the IESO Pathways to Decarbonization study and how the misalignment between how the province is advancing the electrification thus far and municipal climate action plannings, how they're misaligned, what the consequences of those misalignments are, and how we need to come together to become more aligned to actually achieve our climate change imperative ahead of us. So thank you so much, Ralph and Yul, and take it away.
Thanks, Gabby. So we've titled this presentation "An Irresistible Force Meets an Immovable Object." And I think by the end of the presentation, you'll be able to perhaps understand why. So my name is Yule, and I've been working on climate action plans with municipalities for a couple decades. And I'm here with Ralph, who's been working on it for even more decades. We reviewed the IESO's Pathways to Decarbonization study really from the perspective of municipalities, municipal climate action plans. And that was, I think, a really insightful exercise, and we'll go through some of the conclusions that we had. And thank you for coming to a webinar on electricity systems and electricity futures at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. I can only imagine there's many other exciting things that you would rather be doing. So SSG is a workers' cooperative. As an organization, we've been around for about 20 years. We have about 40 staff spread across Chile, US and Canada, mainly in Canada. And we've worked on 100 climate action plans in municipalities of all sizes in all parts of Canada. And increasingly, we're trying to bridge between the municipal paradigm, municipal climate action paradigm, and the electricity paradigm because of the criticality of electricity systems in decarbonizing society. And so it's really that lens that we've brought to this project. And I will pass it over to Ralph to describe, the pathway study.
So I'm just going to give a very brief summary of this study that the IESO published in response to a request or mandate from the government to take a look at two scenarios. One was, what would a moratorium on additional natural gas generation look like? And the other was, what would the electricity system look like in a decarbonized Ontario by the year 2050? And it's that second one that we're really focused on here this evening, the decarbonization scenario. The way that the IESO did this, as far as we can tell from the very thin documentation of their methods and assumptions, is that they started with last year's annual outlook for the future demand for electricity. This is an exercise they do every year. The general approach that's taken in that outlook is the only extent to which you would see decarbonization happening that wasn't going to happen anyway was if there was a law or a regulation requiring it. And so the annual outlook, for example, does include the federal government electric vehicle mandate, and it does include the impact of the City of Toronto's Green Building Standard. But beyond that, it contained very little additional decarbonization initiatives. So from that starting point, what they did with this decarbonization pathway study is they proceeded to make a number of assumptions about what a decarbonized Ontario would look like in 2050. Now, there's a strong agreement, there has been for 10 years now among people who look at what a decarbonized future might look like, that one of its central features is there would be a much greater role for electricity. There's some disagreement over the extent of this increase, but you will not find a credible scenario of how we can get to a low carbon future that does not include a much larger role for electricity in providing heat, which in Ontario has right now mainly provided by natural gas, and a much larger role for electricity in providing transportation, which at this point is provided mainly by gasoline. So it's natural to presume, therefore, that in a future in which electricity goes from providing only lighting and electric devices and a little bit of heat to being the mainstay of the energy system and providing the electricity for electric vehicles and the electricity for heat pumps and space heating, that there would be an increased demand for electricity. And there is agreement on this as well, but here the disagreement over the extent of that increase is quite large. What the IESO study concluded was that the decarbonization scenario for Ontario, in which the heat and the heating systems and the vehicles are electrified would involve a doubling of the consumption of electricity in the province by the year 2050 from its current level of about 150 terawatt hours to around 300 terawatt hours. This would involve an enormous construction program, very intensive. It would go on for decades, really. It involves more than doubling the system from its current capacity of 42 gigawatts, which is like 42 million kilowatts, to 88 gigawatts by the year 2050. But this would require building 69 gigawatts of new capacity, because not only would the growth need to be met, but there are retired plants that would have to be replaced. So lots of new nuclear, lots of new hydro, lots of new solar and wind, lots of new storage. I mean, lots of everything, and a huge build out of the transmission and distribution system, essentially doubling it in size as well, in order to deliver all of this new electricity supply to Ontario municipalities. The cost runs in the range of $400 billion in capital expenditures. That's a big number. I mean, the entire GDP of Canada is only a little over 2,000 billion. So this is an enormous number. It's nearly equivalent to the capital investment in all of Canada in any given year. And it's more than the historical level of capital investment in all of the utilities in Ontario. So if this were to come to pass, a future like this, our future, the next 20, 30 years will be characterized by an enormous amount of construction of the electricity system, focused mainly on very large scale options, big nuclear, big transmission, and expansion of the wind and solar capacity, large wind farms in Northern Ontario, and so on. So that's basically the outlook in the study. One thing, a couple of observations that we noticed in looking at this and comparing it to other ways of thinking about the future role of electricity in Ontario, is that the conclusion you come to when you do this kind of work is partly determined by the frame of reference or the underlying objective or mandate that you're working with. And in the case of the IESO, their mandate is really to provide electricity. And so to operate that system and keep it reliable and all of that. So when they get asked to show what a low carbon version of their world would look like, the response tends to be to treat the requirement that carbon be reduced or eliminated as a constraint on their normal way of planning and modeling the future. In the local climate action plans, which sort of were suggested this evening, provide a different way of looking at the same problem, the problem being how do we decarbonize Ontario and how do we, what would be the role of electricity in that future, that the motivation is different. These community plans are being motivated by the climate emergency. They're looking for ways to decarbonize their communities. Everything is on the table. The electricity system is part of it, but the planning, the transportation system, the land use, all of those other things that determine the pattern and the level of fuel and electricity consumption are included in these municipal action plans. So much broader scope, much more comprehensive in their outlook, as opposed to the narrower focus of the IESO approach. And as the next slide shows, that the result of these differences, as I've already, I think, indicated, is that, well, I'm sorry, one more slide that I forgot was in here. The municipal action plans, therefore, are fundamentally more integrated in their approach. They're looking at all of these different options, whereas the IESO strategy tends to be fairly technologically focused on electricity supply and to a certain extent on the efficiency of electricity demand, using technologies. So the net result of these different approaches, these different methods and assumptions, is that on the one hand, as we've seen, a very, very strong growth in the electricity system in Ontario in the IESO study, 2 to 3% per year from now to the year 2050, doubling the system, as I mentioned earlier, $400 billion would have to be poured into the system just for that, just for the technologies in their study, not counting all of the costs that the municipalities would then have to incur to cope with this doubled top-down electricity system in terms of their distribution system upgrades and so on. In contrast, when we look at the local climate action plans, and there's a lot of them now, and a lot more work has gone into them than went into the IESO study. I think that's fair to say that we have many of these local action plans now. Many of them are 6, some of them 7-figure undertakings, a lot of analysis where they look at what the possibilities are from the ground up in a very disaggregated way, looking at the buildings and the neighborhoods in their communities, looking at what can be done to make them more efficient, how they can make their transportation systems more efficient, how they can reduce the amount of automobile travel that's needed in their cities in the first place. They tend to come up with growth rates in the electricity system that are closer to 1% per year. So there's a big gap here. That's a huge gap. When you're looking at exponential growth, the difference between 1% and 2 to 3% is enormous. So on the one hand, a doubling of the system in the IESO conclusion, whereas the 1% per year would suggest growth that would be more in the neighborhood of perhaps a 50% increase by the year 2050. And we'll come back to that a little bit later, but I'll hand it back to Yul now.
Thanks, Ralph. So one other key difference, I think, between the IESO paradigm and the municipal climate action paradigm is that municipal climate actions are very much grassroots, community-based endeavors that usually involve extensive community engagement, stakeholder engagement, and are ultimately passed by councils who are elected from within their communities. In contrast, IESO is a much more technical process, and you need to speak a really specific language to engage meaningfully with the IESO process. It requires a more sort of a more niche language with which to participate in that process. And it's a much narrower narrower engagement process, although there are, I think, around 300 people or so participated in providing feedback on this particular study. So that, I think, that sort of gives a lot of community weight to the municipal climate action plans, because there's a really strong community momentum for those processes. And so I think all of that is interesting because it leads to the point that municipalities really matter. And as Ralph said, many of them have developed climate action plans. These are extensive single-year, multi-year processes. This is a selection that we've worked on for Ontario municipalities. And these plans are really transformative for the energy system. So, but they're really not on the radar of the IESO. And so the results and pathways that are defined within these plans is not reflected in the IESO's analysis at all. It's almost like you wouldn't know they existed if you just looked at the IESO study. So municipalities not only are defining their energy future, but they also have a historical role in the energy system. And so one of our, I think, conclusions is that it's time for municipalities to really engage again in taking control of the electricity system and having a very strong voice on the future of the electricity system. So how is it possible that you can electrify heating and electrify vehicles and still not get significant growth? And so we've bundled a bunch of climate action plans together here, a number of the ones that I just showed, and looked at annual electricity consumption, which is a different metric than is of primary concern to IESO, who's more concerned with hourly electricity or peak demand. But nevertheless, it gives you a good indication of the future growth. And so you can see there's some cities are growing more quickly. For example, Hamilton, which is projected to electrify significant chunks of the steel industry, so that drives growth. Also, municipalities that have extensive population growth are growing more quickly, whereas others are not growing as fast. But that gives you a sense of what the electricity projection looks like when you sum up a bunch of municipal climate action plans in the context of Ontario. So just to step back a bit more and look at IESO's historical track, or not just IESO, but the historical track record for analysis of electricity system in Ontario, I'll pass it back to Ralph, who was there in person.
Yeah, I got to be careful because I can go on a little bit about this topic, but one of the points that I wanted to make this evening is that we need to look back at our history when we're considering this situation we're in right now. And in my memory, I've been through this, these three major cycles now, where we've had a situation where the Electricity Planning Authority, whether it be Ontario Hydro or after that, the Ontario Power Authority, and now the IESO, has come forward with a projection of what they believe the future demand for electricity needs to be in order to satisfy the demands or whatever mandate they've been given, and what the current capacity is. And they define this huge gap, I call it gapology, between the current demand for electricity and what needs to be built to keep the lights on. The first round for me, and was actually goes back as far as 1976, when Ontario Hydro put a plan on the table that would have involved building post-Arlington 24 more nuclear plants and 18 more large coal plants, all of which would have been online 20 years ago, by about the year 2003-4, in around that time. The capital requirements of that proposal were so large that it was that was really what alarmed the Conservative government of the day, which was headed by Bill Davis and Treasurer Darcy McHugh. So they called a timeout and appointed the Dean of Engineering at the University of Toronto, Arthur Porter, to head up a Royal Commission to look in how Ontario's electricity planning could have gotten so far detached and unhinged from reality as to put forward a plan which anybody could take one look at and say, well, that simply can't happen. We can't afford it. It's physically impossible. And it wasn't clear to some of us that it was based on a realistic understanding of the future demand for electricity. None of those plants to this day have ever been built. The gap never did materialize. 10 years later, in 1989, Ontario Hydro came forward again with a fairly large capital expansion plan. It was called the Demand Supply Plan. Again, they were predicting a very large gap was going to develop, which by 2014, so by nearly 10 years ago, would have been 21.3 gigawatts. The gap would have been that big between the capacity of the system and what we needed. To give you a sense of how wrong they were, that's the total peak demand today in Ontario, more or less. We're a little above that, but around 22,000 megawatts. Environmental assessment was called to look at this plan, but before it was finished, Hydro withdrew the plan when they started to realize that the demand wasn't just going to show up the way they thought it was. The gap never did materialize. None of the plants in that plan were ever built. Fast forward again to 2005, 2007. Again, we now had the Ontario Power Authority fairly recently set up. And we hadn't been doing any electricity planning at all in Ontario at that point for a number of years. We had such a surplus of capacity from previous overestimation of how much needed to be built. But they thought, okay, it looks like we better start thinking about building again. We got a gap. This time, the prediction was that demand for electricity by 2020 would be 177 terawatt hours. To this day, it's still below 150. It's never gotten above 154, which is about where it was peaking at the time that this plan was put forward. The Liberal government of the day expedited the approval of those gas plants, which caused so much scandal and headache over the years. Plants which it turns out really weren't needed. Again, the gap just simply never materialized. The reason I've gone into this in a little bit of depth is that it's fair to think that, well, maybe it's different this time. After all, as I stated at the outset, we are talking about electrifying our cars and electrifying our heating systems. Surely that does mean that the system will have to grow. Don't disagree with that. But I tried to reproduce the growth rates in the IESO study, and to see where they were finding this 150 terawatt hours of growth. And there's not much to go on because they don't reveal their assumptions in any detail. But I assume that the buildings would there'd be no improvement in the efficiency of the existing buildings, that new buildings would not get any more efficient as they were built, that there would be no reductions in the heating and ventilating and air conditioning intensity that result from the conversion to smart buildings and heat pumps that's going on. That there would be no improvements in electric vehicle efficiency, that the heat pumps that were in the scenario had efficiencies that are below what we're already seeing are fairly commonplace now, that there would be no improvement in industrial energy efficiency. And even with all of these assumptions, I could not get more than 100 terawatt hours of new demand showing up by 2050. So there's a big gap in our understanding of how much electricity we need to make sure that electricity can serve the role that it needs to serve in the decarbonization of our society. And the gap relates to some of the issues that we touched on earlier. If you look at the system without considering all of the changes that are going on underneath the surface from the point of view of the IESO, you will miss all of the things that are moderating the demand. That's what happened in 1976. That's why they missed it again in 1989. That's why they missed it again in 2007. And you would think, given all of the billions of dollars that were wasted and the bankrupting of our utility that resulted over it, that by now we would have a more sophisticated approach going on to thinking about how this needs to unfold to ensure that we get the electricity system we need without overbuilding and malinvesting. But one has to be concerned that we are still seeing electricity supply projections that are wildly high compared to what would be the optimum, most cost-effective way to proceed. And the reason this is important to all of us, and especially to municipalities, is that the IESO system that is outlined in this report is in direct contradiction to the type of future that's envisaged in these local climate action plans. And they have the potential to be mutually destructive in the sense that if the investment in the IESO system proceeds, according to the type of vision we see in this report, we will have another round of stranded assets and half-built plants that we don't need. I can guarantee it, but will still have to be paid for. This will drive up the unit price of electricity and undermine the plans that these local action plans are making for decarbonizing. On the other hand, if these local action plans proceed with successful implementation of the strategies that they are wanting to implement in their communities, that will underline the demand for the IESO's future and will be the cause of the stranded assets and the the vicious circle basically starts to develop between efforts that are pulling in different directions with respect to the future of our electricity system. So the gap we really have to close in this province is one that we need to close by having an open, transparent conversation about everybody's assumptions and everybody's analyses and viewpoints on this so that we can come to some sort of agreement about what a reasonable path forward might look like. Back to you, Yoel.
Thanks, Ralph. So all of that, I think, leads to the question of, well, how do municipalities or how do community climate action plans actually limit the growth in electricity in a way that IESO doesn't really understand? And I think part of that is that when you take a community perspective, you have to try and understand a lot of the detail of the community. And it's very hard to understand that same level of detail at a provincial scale. But this is an example from City of Toronto. On the left-hand side, it's the energy consumption in a business's plan scenario going out till 2050. On the right-hand side is the net zero by 2040 scenario, which council passed a year and a half ago, I think it was. And what you can see is that total energy actually declines. And that is because the electrified system is much more efficient than the current fossil-based system. So electric vehicles are 4 or 5 times more efficient than gasoline vehicles, and heat pumps are 3 or more times more efficient than natural gas boilers. And so that efficiency gain gives you a bunch of savings. On the electricity side, you're still adding potential load. So the big factor, the big variable that results in gains on electricity is building retrofits. And it's interesting because if you use the demand type or the type of optimization model that IESO uses to evaluate these scenarios, retrofits are considered quite expensive. And so they wouldn't get as much traction or as much place in a scenario as, for example, new generation capacity. But in this paradigm, retrofits are what really keeps the actual demand from electricity down and reduces the need for new capacity. So it's an avoid technique rather than a provide new supply technique. And I think retrofits are kind of a magic lever in that sense. And while they may be more expensive in certain ways, they generate all sorts of co-benefits as well. And those co-benefits are another aspect that isn't really assessed in the IESO paradigm. In addition to retrofits, you also have behind the meter generation, decentralized generation, and that's also quite limited in the IESO scenarios. So that can also reduce the demand that the provincial grid sees because that electricity is used locally on buildings or on the same buildings where it's generated or nearby. So those are the factors I think that IESO really doesn't have as much visibility into as we do when we're working at the community scale. So another piece that we noted, this is a broader sort of critique or question, I think, about the IESO's pathway study, is that the deployment of wind and solar is really limited in that analysis. And you can see by 2050, what IESO projected here, just over 25%. And similar studies, one for the UK by the Climate Change Committee, found over 60% renewables, and one for National Renewable Energy Laboratory, again, found over 60%, being for the UK and US respectively. Those deployments of renewables were by 2035. IESO's was by 2050. So why is the IESO limiting the use of renewables relative to other similar kinds of studies? And there may be some practical reasons to that, which we are not privy to. But clearly one is that the modeling approach that IESO uses puts constraints on the deployment of wind by applying a remarkably high price to wind associated with transmission. And the rationale for that is not apparent to us. And the effect of that constraint is that it actually adds a bunch of nuclear to the system rather than wind. And that may be, I guess the logic for that is not, at least from an economic perspective, is not immediately apparent. So that was a question that came up when we were looking at the scenarios. Another, I think, sort of different kind of critique is that if you take the US National Renewable Energy Laboratory study, they really try and make an effort at looking at all costs. So both the capital and operating costs, but also what could be termed external costs. So these are the costs of avoided damage from climate change, the costs from the avoided health impacts associated with combustion of fossil fuels. So those are both represented in yellow and the red and yellow bars here, and they actually significantly exceed the capital costs or the system costs of the deployment of the decarbonized electricity system, which is in the blue bar. And so IESO really only considered the blue bar, didn't consider the social cost of carbon or the health benefits, which really leaves you with a limited picture. So all of those observations lead us to a series of recommendations, which I will quickly whip through so we can have more discussion. The first one is we need more scenarios. We only got one scenario. Anyone who does scenario planning knows that if you only have one scenario, you're really limiting your options for the future. What about a scenario with more renewables? What about a scenario with more demand side measures? There's lots of interesting scenarios that would be important to explore and then to compare the costs of those scenarios. And we really didn't see that in the IESO study. We need an integrated energy systems analysis. We need to look at demand and supply from a bottom up so that we can capture a lot of the dynamics that we discussed earlier. More broadly, we've seen other electricity regulators' mandates be adjusted to reflect the need to decarbonize urgently. For example, Ofgem in the UK just had its mandate adjusted. Similarly, some of the regulators in the west coast of the US have had their mandates adjusted as well. So that's a key element that's really beyond the scope of IESO, but is more of a political requirement. We would like to understand from a municipality's perspective, the regional impacts of the scenarios in terms of jobs, in terms of co-benefits. Different scenarios will result in different economic impacts on communities. Centralized generation will benefit just a few areas, whereas decentralized will benefit more communities. So understanding those dynamics is important for municipalities. The climate impacts are not are significant for the electricity system in terms of demand, driving heating in winter and cooling in the summer, but those are not evaluated within the IESO study. They also impact supply. So understanding those variables on how the electricity system works would be another important recommendation. Ralph mentioned transparency. We need more transparency so that we can understand the basis for the scenarios, or the scenarios that we need, not just the one scenario. I talked about a full economic assessment. It needs to include all the costs and benefits, or at least those that we know how to quantify, of which we certainly know how to quantify health and avoided costs from climate change. I think another piece is a risk analysis. There's sort of a big headline, this could cost $400 billion. We think, well, for example, 400 billion would be useful, but I wouldn't spend it on supply. We might spend it more on demand side measures like retrofits, which deliver a whole bunch of co-benefits. So looking at the risks of deploying that capital as an opportunity cost and as a potential stranded asset in different scenarios would also be really important in order to enable us to decide which scenario actually would make sense. There's a nuts and bolts thing around GHG accounting protocols and aligning that with the way municipalities account for emissions. A question around distribution, because the many municipalities own local distribution companies who are plotting out their own futures in a decarbonized reality and reflecting that in IESO's projection, but also reflecting the impact of IESO scenarios on the LDCs. And then the final piece is to ensure that the scenarios that municipalities have developed and put their blood, sweat, and tears into, as it were, are reflected in the regional electricity planning. So those are the recommendations we have based on everything that we've said, and that's that.
Good. Thank you so much, you guys. So now we can kind of move into some of the questions and answers that people have. I'm just going to go for folks who are mentioning, asking about the recording. Yes, there will be a recording, and yes, I'll send it out to you with via email along with the presentation and the link to the report. Please share it with others who you think should be interested and engaged in this conversation. That would be greatly appreciated. And so just a few months before publishing the Pathways report, the IESO published Ontario's Distributed Energy Resources Potential Study. They recently accepted applications for demonstration projects on low carbon hydrogen, plus they have a study on offshore wind. None of these were included in Pathways. Seems odd. One hand ignores the other. That's just more of a comment. Is there no reference at all to the province's climate target in the report, in the Pathways to Decarbonization study? I didn't see it, to be honest. I didn't actually. The Pathways to Decarbonization study was advanced because of a directive from the Minister of Energy to the IESO to undertake this study. I can actually tell you there isn't an all-of-government approach thus far on the 2030 GHG reduction that the province of Ontario has. So there is no climate mandate on Enbridge as the fossil fuel distributor in Ontario. So they don't have a climate target that they have to achieve that would correspond to their contribution to the 30% reduction by 2030 dates. So there isn't at thus far an all-of-government approach, even with the non-science-based GHG reduction target for 2030 that the province of Ontario has. Anything you guys want to add, Ralph or Yule, to that?
I don't think I have anything to add. Do you, Ralph?
No, not me either. That sums it up.
Perfect. All right. Is the Auditor General part of energy resource planning in Ontario? I'm thinking about directions that they are on that are the most cost effective. This assumes that the analysis includes 100% of the soup to nuts cost of each form of energy supply and non-energy supply options. So Tim, I did want to kind of share, I did have some conversations with staff at the Auditor General's office to try and understand if they have ever considered the risks associated with stranded assets as part of their review that they undertake. It's not something that they've traditionally done in the past. They always end up looking back rather than looking forward in terms of their way they undertake their audit. So it's something that's not necessarily geared towards. I did want to kind of, I still have it on my to-do list, which I have not done yet, but I will share it on the link. The Auditor General did a review of the gas plants cancellations in Oakville and Mississauga. And so I wanted to go and dig into those reports to see if the Auditor General has considered stranded assets and brought that into their analysis. It's still going to be a very challenging one. That's something that the government really needs to do, because the government is the one forward thinking and the Auditor General is the one backwards looking to kind of do a review to see whether the outcomes that the government hoped to achieve was actually achieved and the value for price on that one. So it's not necessarily the if that's what you were thinking was the direction, it's not the clearest kind of way to do it. It really needs to have the government be forward thinking and bringing in those stranded asset risks and costing that out into its analysis rather than leaving it as a potential. It is, it is mentioned, but it's not brought into the cost analysis or the risk analysis. Anything you guys want to add on the stranded asset risk?
It's a huge risk.
It's a huge risk. Yeah. Tim, is there anything else that you wanted to add? I can just, if you would like, I can unmute you if you would like to be able to ask your question verbally.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, take it away.
Boy, there's so much, and thank you for giving me that open mic, Gabby. Thank you very much, Yoel and Ralph. This is very, very interesting, confirmed a lot of my suspicions. I find it rather interesting that in the narrative of the government, that the words we hear are clean energy. I have challenged them directly to say, what do you mean by clean energy? I think I know what they mean by clean energy, but I would like to have them hear it. You never hear the words solar and wind come out of this government at all. And and Gabby knows this, I read about what's going on around the world, and oh my God, countries are tripping over putting those technologies in because they are just penciling out to be much more economic than even the existing incumbent or legacy technology. And it just, baffles me that this government is, not taking this more seriously, and it's just absolutely frightening. I totally agree with the kind of the non-generation part of the equation as well. I think there are a lot of opportunities to just to save on energy. The best form of energy is the energy you just don't need, period. End of discussion. And I really think, I'm not really asking questions here, but I really think that there's an asymptotic assumption that's going to come about over the next 25, 30 years. And that is, we're going to may never get there entirely, but we're going to approach it getting to zero marginal cost energy. And if Ontario is still mucking about with marginal cost forms of energy, we are going to become uncompetitive. We will not be able to compete. We'll not be able to retain nor attract investment in our province. So that's kind of all I have. That's a bit of a soapbox, not really a question, but just points I wanted to mention. So I'll get off here and let others join. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Anything you guys want to respond, Ralph, or you on Tim's comments?
So I don't know a ton about this, but I know in Washington State, they're already dealing with zero margin electricity issues in their projections and in their regulatory context. And I haven't been directly involved. Some of my colleagues have been working on some of that, but I know that was a discussion that's coming up, and it just turns everything on its head. And
So
they're already talking about that. So
can you explain zero margin electricity?
Ralph might be able to better than I can.
Okay, Ralph?
Well, I think what it means is that you get to the point where the electric, I think what Tim is referring to is the fact that the electricity is there whether you use it or not. I mean, there's no operational cost involved once you have a solar plant in place. It's not like a gas plant or a nuclear plant or a coal plant where there's a marginal cost of fueling it and maintaining it. There's very little maintenance costs with these plants as well. Wind has a little bit more. Is that the definition that you were using, Tim, when you brought the term into the conversation?
Yes, that's absolutely notionally
Yeah.
exactly what I'm talking about.
I'd also add that this competitive issue that you brought up is perhaps more important for Canada than most countries, because so much of our international balance, and this is getting a little bit beyond Ontario and a little bit beyond Ontario's electricity system, although it ties back to it. But so much of Canada's balance of payments in the recent decades has been underpinned by oil and gas exports. And sooner or later, maybe sooner, maybe a little bit later, the export earnings that this country has got from selling oil and gas into the global markets is going to decline. And if we want to continue to be a prosperous country in the 21st century, we need to be good at doing the things that the 21st century economy is going to be built upon. And it's pretty clear now, and it's not just a theoretical observation, it's clear from the numbers that are rolling in around the world where these technologies are growing much faster and the investment in them is growing much faster than it is in North America, that the future is about sustainable technologies, sustainable energy, sustainable sources of protein, smart buildings, renewable electricity. All of those things are going to be the foundation of prosperity in the 21st century, not unlike the way fossil fuels and the automobile were foundational industries in the 20th century. And countries which had a piece of those industries, like we did, tended to do pretty well. We're in risk of falling behind if we don't pivot rather quickly to being a source of the things, the products and the services that the world needs to get through this sustainability transition. And so there's a lot at stake here for Canada to get out in front of this and not be a follower.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree like on that one. It's one of the key things that like for so long, Canada has kind of used to kind of like really be more geared towards as a third world country in the sense that we sell our raw resources to other countries and then buy manufactured products back to us. And with the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, bringing a lot of investment of clean technologies to the United States, Canada does risk being competitive in comparison to the United States on this energy transition and decarbonization transition coming our way. So it would really like I really am concerned in the sense that Ontario and Canada as a whole, I really want us to be a participant in this low carbon energy transformation. I don't want to be a consumer of some other jurisdictions' leadership in this area. I want Ontario to be a leader in this area, and I want us to be benefiting from this energy transition and be a player in it rather than just a consumer from other jurisdictions' economies. And it's really important for Ontario to do that. Yeah, no, there is true that I haven't heard as much Ontario government talk about climate change either on this one. We know that one of the key important aspects of this is that we really need to ensure that all governments are acting on climate change at the ambition level that we need to have them on this one. Right now, there isn't any government that is taking the leadership and role that the climate imperative calls for us, but there's certainly ones that are moving further towards that. And we really want Ontario to be one of those players in this low carbon transformation. So those are some of the questions. Can anyone comment on the momentum building up in Windsor for the installation of heat pumps by homeowners? I would say that it's not just happening in Windsor. Like you can see the heat pumps are becoming way sexier than they ever were in the past. And we're all cheering that on that one. There is a lot of momentum finally coming into bringing in heat pumps into the lexicon and our conversations across average person. We still have a huge amount of work ahead of us on this one to do. But I think that's one of the key aspects of this is the heat pumps are going to be critical to the electrification of our building heating, whether it be from ground source, air source, water source, or any of those kind of things on that one. But that is absolutely critical for it. And energy efficiency, that's one of the key things that I think is really important. Even if we do put all our eggs in the supply basket, which is what the traditional route is for the province of Ontario, and the IESO's pathways of decarbonization, it still shows they have a bias towards putting their eggs in the increasing supply basket. And that's the way they've done things in the past. It was their options available probably to them in the past, but it's not the options available to us right now and not to the future. And we know that we have a fundamental mismatch that if we put all our eggs in the increasing supply basket, that's going to increase electricity prices, which is going to undermine decarbonization efforts. And it's a vicious circle that could, or we could turn it instead into a virtuous cycle and really advance the energy efficiency opportunities and bring those economic and job creation opportunities to all Ontario communities, which is something supply could never be able to do. Please mute you, Gabby. Okay, sorry. Yes. I did. Okay, you got it. All right. All right. So I wanted to thank everyone for taking their time on a Tuesday evening to discuss this topic, which is a really, really important topic, but also a very complicated one. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to Ralph and to Yul for undertaking this study, for helping to explain a lot of things that everybody was very confused about on why there's discrepancy between the provincial energy planning and the municipal energy planning, and how important it is for municipalities to take and communities and municipalities to take a strong role in engaging in the energy conversation. This is really important. We need to talk about energy, and all of us in Ontario, well, everywhere, but in Ontario, we're going to talk about now, need to start talking about energy. We've got to find a better way to decarbonize our electricity system. And we've also got to find advance opportunities with regards to reducing energy demand and advancing energy efficiency opportunities for our economic development, job creation, climate change, energy poverty, reducing energy poverty goals. There's so many benefits associated with this if we do this right, but we all need to be putting the effort into engaging with the entities that we need to change their energy planning to take a more holistic approach and not to put all their eggs in the supply basket like they did in the past. All right, so thank you so much, Ralph. Thank you, Yul. Thank you to all of you for joining us, and I will send you around the email for you to share. Please do share this report and this webinar with others who you think will be interested. And if you have any comments or questions or additional networks that you think would be able to get this report out to, please do reach out to me, and I'd be happy to join to help you out do that. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you, Gabby.
Awesome.
Thanks so much, you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you for advancing this conversation. I really appreciate that.
Take care.
Take care. I'll speak to you later.